Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. This week, in the last pod before we take a summer break, we look back at the previous 6 months and also discuss the expectations for the rest of the year. After a flurry of regulatory interventions, what's the current thinking in Brussels and Berlin as the energy crisis seems to have eased? Is it too early to say that the crisis is over? And what have policymakers got up their sleeves? Joining me, Richard Sverrisson, to unravel the events so far this year and looking ahead are Siobhan, our Brussels correspondent, and Nathan Witkop, our Germany correspondent. I'd like to start by asking you, Siobhan, as we seem to be heading out of the energy crisis, it's maybe too soon to say it's over, can we expect fewer regulatory inventions?
I think if the market and the conditions continue as they are at the moment, what we're hearing from policymakers generally is cautious optimism. So there's recognition that it was an extreme situation over the last winter, but conditions now have improved, particularly on the gas side, and policymakers are trying to move away from crisis measures done very quickly and trying to start to think long-term again about how to avoid being in such a difficult situation in the future.
And maybe looking towards more standardised sort of pan-EU interventions or regulation rather than fragmentation across member states. Would that be maybe a correct assumption?
Exactly. One of the fears is always that national governments will rush to introduce measures that protect their citizens, but at the risk of fragmenting the internal EU market. And so we're hearing a lot from the Commission and some of the policymakers that not to forget that all the benefits that come from having an integrated electricity market, and that it is important to keep that ability to trade across borders and to have a harmonised and coordinated approach to avoid essentially disrupting competition between EU countries at a time when Europe wants to be improving its competitiveness with regions such as the US and China.
What have been the key issues over the past 6 months? Obviously, one set of proposals looms very large, the market design reform.
Yeah, so the key issue is always price. I mean, the price, we talk about an energy crisis, but it was a price crisis, very much an energy price crisis. And so some of the responses you see are a limit on how much revenue the cheaper power generators can keep, because the price is so high. Policymakers think you've got incredible margins, everyone's suffering from high prices, let's claw back some of that money and redistribute it. But obviously, we're also in a situation where policymakers need to have an awful lot of investment in new capacity, and that will only come if there is money and revenues coming in for companies to invest in the low carbon technologies like renewables, and if you're in France, nuclear, to go forward to have the long-term solution to the price crisis, because the price crisis was based on high prices of imported gas. Well, a lot of it was based on high prices for imported gas. So there's a long-term policy to try and move away from imported gas, but you have this short-term, how do we help consumers now? And that's when they were coming in with emergency measures like the revenue cap on low-cost power generation. In certain regions, like in Spain, a cap on gas prices, use of power generation, and also measures to reduce demand for gas overall. So these were all measures intended to try and soften the blow of the high prices on end consumers.
So we can see an end to the emergency measures then, do you think?
So we will see some of the emergency measures may become permanent, and they are things like having a European LNG index, which is put together by the EU regulatory agency ACER. That's sort of administrative, so that's okay. That doesn't really have much day-to-day impact on where prices are. It's just about bringing more transparency to the market. But there are some things which are much more disputed. And so, for example, there is a debate at the moment on whether the EU should keep a cap on revenues earned by low-cost power generators. And that's something that's being debated in the European Council, which is national governments, and also in the European Parliament. And they will have to agree on that. The Commission doesn't want it. The Commission is clear that that cap, it serves its purpose. We shouldn't have it going forward. The risk of fragmenting the EU power market is too great. So it'll be really interesting to see how that argument, that debate plays out.
So, Siobhan, the market design reform package, what are the main sticking points at the moment?
So the key sticking point is about how two-way contracts for differences are going to be used. Now, a contract for difference is a way of fixing the price for generation from a generation asset. And if the market price goes above that fixed price, then the generator has to pay money back to the government. And if it goes below that fixed price, the government has to pay money to the generator. So it's a way for the generator to have visibility, long-term visibility on the returns. And it's a way for a government to support a particular asset, knowing what price it is supporting it at, and that it's not going to, the government is not exposed to losing lots of money if the market price falls too much. So that's a contract for difference. The problem that in the debate is that the Commission has proposed an option that would allow such contracts for differences to be used to extend the life of nuclear power stations. And this would be a major advantage to France, and other countries are concerned that this will close off the market in France, because in France there's a big national operator, EDF, which has a very large nuclear fleet. And so if all of that nuclear fleet ends up being on a fixed price, there's no more, or there's very little marginal pricing going on in France. It's a big problem for Germany, for Belgium, the Netherlands, but particularly for Germany. It's a very big sticking point. And then the next big sticking point is that Poland is asking for a temporary lifting of emission limits for power stations that can be supported through a capacity remuneration mechanism, which is another way that national governments can encourage particular technologies to be invested in. And Poland's argument is that it needs to be able to support Ukraine, where their power system is under pressure because of the Russian invasion. So these emission limits that were set and agreed some years ago, they were very, very contentious at the time. And Germany is very unhappy at the idea of these emission limits being reopened and the idea that coal plants could be subsidised. It's happy with coal plants being able to run, but not subsidising them. So those are two big issues in the market design debate.
And I wonder how that will how they'll reach a compromise on those issues.
Although people talk about, we're always interested in the key issues and the key sticking point, but it's a very common understanding that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So we have a lot of horse trading when we come to agreeing EU legislation. And so if you get something in one part, then you have to give up something in another part. So there's also a proposal as I was saying earlier, there's also differing views on what to do with a revenue cap for low-cost power generators. And that's something that might get caught up in the mix between the capacity mechanisms and the contract for differences. How it lands will depend on the majority that the negotiators can find with the most countries. So basically it's very difficult to say at the moment, but at the moment it looks like there's clearly sympathy for supporting Ukraine, so there might be something to give Poland on that. And France will need extra nuclear capacity because, as we saw in the last 12 months or so, French nuclear availability has a big impact on prices. So these are all issues that people will have to take into account. How it will end will depend on finding some kind of technical language that reassures people that the desired goal will be achieved and not like a carte blanche to go and do whatever you like. So very, very clear, defined, strict rules on what is allowed.
But would you then expect, that the contracts for difference for existing plants that would be passed, that would go through?
I guess it depends on what France and the Commission and other countries can do to reassure Germany that it won't end up distorting the internal energy market. So there will need to be some kind of guarantees and reassurances written in to reassure Germany that if it sees a problem, it can say, you're out of line, you need to get back in line.
Absolutely. But those are the sticking points. Those are the difficult areas, Siobhan. What's actually been agreed on?
So this legislation is being discussed and debated on a very fast time frame. So the easy things, from what I heard, some of the easier things that have been agreed is things like promoting energy communities. So, individuals have solar panels on their roofs, they can form groups and share power between them. So the legislation has to be agreed by both national governments and the European Parliament, and those negotiations between them haven't started yet. So we're still at the stage where we're waiting for the national governments to decide, well, as we speak. It may have changed by the time this goes out, but we're still waiting for the national governments to decide what their negotiating position is. We won't know the Parliament's negotiating position until mid-July. So there are some slight delays in the national governments reaching their position, but it doesn't affect the overall timeline. EU leaders have been very clear they want the whole package agreed by the end of this year.
Okay, so what can we expect in the coming weeks and months then, Siobhan? What's on the agenda in Brussels?
Some fierce lobbying from all the interested parties from the power sector on what should be in the final European market design. I mean, there are lots of things in there that the power industry is not keen on. So they're not necessarily keen on contracts for differences for existing plants. There are some issues in there about mandatory hedging, which they think might be counterproductive. But one of the things that everyone in the industry is very happy is in the proposal is keeping the marginal pricing system, so keeping the merit order of using the cheapest plant first. And that's a big thing, because there have been some countries that have been pushing to go for weighted average pricing according to the technology, all kinds of things that the sector argues would completely fragment the market again, and we'd lose the benefits of having an integrated market. So that's what we'll see in the next few weeks on the market design. And then in the background, there are lots of proposals that have already been agreed in principle that will be coming through and being rubber stamped and entering the door. So like the Renewables Directive that set higher targets for renewables. We just saw new criteria for defining hydrogen. Renewable hydrogen have been adopted. They're coming into full
That's
soon.
the so-called additionality, isn't it?
Yes, the so-called
just explain that,
rule.
Siobhan.
So because the EU wants to decarbonise its economy, it has identified that it will need to use more decarbonised gases. And those decarbonised gases are likely to need to be produced from renewable power. So we will need more renewable power, but we also need more renewable power to meet decarbonisation targets in other areas. So the hydrogen additionality rules are intended to ensure that the renewable power that is used for creating renewable hydrogen is from new capacity. So you're not cannibalising the renewable electricity that you need to decarbonise the sectors that can directly use electricity.
Yeah, no, I mean that's also been quite a big sticking point, hasn't it? But for some parts of the market. But and apart from that, you've also got the net zero legislation,
as in the encouraging investment in industry generally to go net zero. Yes, so that's the sort of a slightly newer area. It's tangential to the energy side, but it's going to affect all the components that the energy sector will need to build the renewables to go to net zero. So that's the Commission's response to the US Inflation Reduction Act. That's also going through. It's a bit more tangential, but the energy sector is keeping an eye on it because it could affect the costs of the investments that they need to make in order to meet the decarbonisation target.
And from what I understand, some companies are waiting to see what kind of proposals, what's on the table from the EU in order to whether, to the decision about where to make their investments.
Yeah, so a lot of the discussion at the moment is about, and this is a discussion, I've been in Brussels 20 years, I've never heard a discussion that didn't include the phrase, what we want is strong, stable, predictable regulation. And we have sympathy for that. I mean, I'm sure policymakers have sympathy for that. One of the difficulties is that they also, in this battle against climate change, they're having to ratchet up the targets every few years. So every few years they're going, okay, but to get to net zero by 2050, we need to ratchet up what we're doing now in order to achieve that in the future. which means that we need to go back into our stable, predictable legislation and tweak it to make sure we're on this right track. So we hear often about that all the industry wants is predictable timeframes going out 20, 30 years, ideally. It's not going to happen because they know that the stable outcome is it has to be net zero by 2050. So it will be tweaked every 5 years. Every 5 to 10 years, it will be ratcheted up to get to 2050. And so the call from the industry is to make those tweaks as predictable as possible. But that's obviously very difficult because things happen that no one expects. You go from a COVID crisis where demand plummeted to a Russia invades Ukraine supply crisis. You lose 40% of Russian gas virtually overnight, and we don't know what's going to happen. So it's very difficult to have stable. It's very difficult to have stable.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Stable legislation.
I can understand the desire and the wish for that to happen, but it's quite hard to realise. So it sounds like a very busy few weeks and months ahead, Siobhan. But also everything stops in August in
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, July and August.
July and August.
So basically, there's a rush to get things to a certain point by the middle of July, and then tumbleweed whilst everyone's on holiday, and then come back at the end of August, early September, and that'll be a very busy time when people are finalising the details and really pushing for their desired outcomes, because once it's agreed, and then it's in law, and then we move to the implementation side, which is always interesting. It's one thing to agree what people should do, but then you always have to see whether people actually do it.
Exactly. That's the other side of the coin.
It's not the end of it's not the end of the story just because it's in law.
Absolutely. Siobhan, thank you very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast.
Thank you, Richard.
So we've been talking about Brussels, but I'd like to switch our attention now to Germany. Nathan, what have been the key issues in the country over the past 6 months?
I think energy security came to the forefront. If we cast our mind back 6 months ago, we were still in the middle of winter, and there was still plenty of concern about whether we would make it through without an even more severe energy crisis. The first signs that the energy crisis was going to be not so bad that we would make it through the winter without blackouts or without an even sharper spike in prices were probably already there to be seen in late December, early January, because we'd made it through the first hump, so to speak. We'd managed to save quite a lot of gas early on. But even though we're in a better position, much better position now than we were last year, everybody, I think, from the regulators down, wants to reaffirm the message that we're not out of the woods yet, that there is still scope for, I guess, very high prices to return, that we will continue to need demand-saving measures, or at least reduce demand, and we will need to bring on as much new supply as possible, as quickly as possible, in order to get through at least the next year or two.
And I think you've seen a massive growth in LNG capacity. It's quite remarkable how quickly that has been achieved, isn't it?
Yes, I think many Germans were surprised at how quickly they could get this done when they needed to. There's been a bit of back-patting going on in terms of well done, everyone. Having said that, there is also the admission that a lot of this came down to luck. We had a very mild start to the winter. I think it was the mildest start to winter in 30 years, or at least in the 30 years of measurements. It was one of the mildest winters, not the mildest, but one of the mildest that we've had over this period too. So that helped a lot and reduced the call on storage until later in the winter. So that gave everyone a break. The challenge is that as we go into the next winter, even if we have full storage, we could potentially go through that if there is a cold winter. So there really is a continued need to limit demand, and there's a continued need for stable flows from alternative suppliers to Russia. And at the moment, that looks fine, and we are seeing demand reductions maintained. I mean, at the moment, I think it's down in total in Germany on a weekly basis. It's down 20% from normal levels for the time of year, and that's pretty staggering.
I'm sorry, Nathan, I didn't mean to interrupt, but is that industrial or household or both?
That's total.
Right.
So that includes industrial, and in fact, industrial consumption is on a weekly basis has at times been even lower than that. So up to a quarter or so down year on year, and I guess that points to another part of the problem, which is how persistent is this going to be? How much of this demand is going to come back? And how much have we already begun to reduce that demand permanently through a loss of industry, through a loss of industrial competitiveness?
I mean, that must be a big concern for German policymakers and politicians, and indeed the electorate at large, the population at large even. How much of this is deindustrialization of one of Europe's, most lively and most important industrial centres,
Of course, yeah. Germany's economy is oriented towards exports. It's oriented towards selling into a global economy that you get the impression is rapidly disappearing, where we have this problem with our erstwhile main supplier of gas, a cheap source of commodities, and we may have a problem with one of our largest export markets in future, China. So this is very bad news for the German economy broadly, and we've seen the last 2 quarters of gross domestic product have contracted. So, I mean, technically we're in recession, and industrial production remains lower, it remains weak. Sectors that are very exposed to energy costs, like chemicals, complain about the ongoing costs, even though the front month contract that we look at on the Dutch TTF hub, that might be down a lot from the crisis levels that we saw last year. Still, the overall costs that are fed through over the course of this crisis continue to remain elevated by historical standards, and that's weighing on industry. They want relief as quickly as possible, and they want the government to find a way to make energy cheaper.
Well, that's, in a way, in a global market, that's obviously quite some task, I would say. But in terms of, so we have security of supply, and obviously the energy price crisis has been at the centre of what's happening in Germany in terms of policymakers and attempting to shield people from the crisis. But what are the other kind of sticking points over the last 6 months, Nathan, in terms of German energy policy?
Well, it ties into this. So ultimately, Germany needs to marry its energy security demands that have been amplified now through the crisis, through the war in Ukraine. It needs to marry these to its long-term ambitions regarding climate change, addressing emissions, bringing them down to net zero by the middle of 2040s. So on one level, it looks like these things can be married, of course. Less use of gas, etc., less use of fossil fuels is going to need to occur in order to cut emissions. But on the other hand, you can't just do that overnight, and people need the energy security here and now. Industry needs the gas here and now. So it's the big challenge, of course, was then to switch to LNG to get as much LNG supply in the near term. And of course, it's like a triangle, bringing down the costs for doing all of this. So I guess the sticking points going ahead, you've got 2 areas. On the industrial side, industry is clamoring for cheaper energy. They are concerned about what happens when emergency measures introduced last year expire at the end of this year. We need an interim solution. Germany hopes that in the long run, it'll bring down the costs of its energy through mass deployment of renewable energy, which is, low-cost renewable energy. If you follow developments in renewables, you see, of course, the costs of solar and wind just keep on falling. In the long run, that's all well and good, but before we get there, over the next coming years, industry needs a solution. And so, you have proposals like Robert Habeck, the economy minister, wants to try and target a price level of around 60 euros a megawatt hour for German industry. But how do you do that? Are you going to basically subsidize them, pay Peter by taking away from Paul? You're going to put the costs onto the backs of German energy consumers more broadly. How's that going to fit in with European competition law? There's some reservations around the idea of using contracts for difference, where basically two parties, producers, consumers, agree on a price that energy should be, and if wholesale prices deviate around that, then one or the other compensates the other. And that all sounds nice, but if the government is backstopping these things, intervening more in markets, it's taking away liquidity from the market itself to come up with its own solutions. And that's a concern that industry expresses as well, is how much is the government unleashing a cascade of further interventions that get rid of markets by intervening to try and save things in the short term. So that's one side. And of course, the other side is what this means for the general public in terms of the transformation of our heating systems.
There was an almighty spat, wasn't there, in the coalition about the heat pumps, the installation of heat pumps for households.
Indeed. So on one level, indeed, electrification of heating, where it is possible, it makes a lot of sense. And heat pumps are, from an energy perspective, more efficient, and that would be a great way of bringing down Germany's demand for gas for heating purposes. And you have to remember that gas for power generation in Germany is not that much. Most of Germany's gas demand, and Germany is the biggest source of gas demand in Europe, goes towards heating and industry. So if you can electrify this sort of sector, then you can bring down you can eliminate a lot of the problem by displacing that with electric heat pumps. The trouble is, I guess, who's going to bear the brunt of this, and how are you going to go about doing it? And I suppose from another perspective is, should the country not be more? If the government is saying that this is the technology that we're picking, then get into that discussion about are we picking winners, and isn't the market better placed? Sometimes I think that's a bit disingenuous, if I'm going to just comment myself, because I imagine that certain people who are trying to protect their own industry use this as a way to keep certain structures in place longer. So it has been a controversial topic, not least also because of the ownership structure of homes in Germany. I mean, most people rent, and so who pays for modernizing our households' heating system? A landlord doesn't necessarily have an interest in this, and he certainly doesn't want to have to foot the bill and then get nothing out of it. So you do have some sort of missing money problems. What's the role of the government in driving this? What incentives do you put in place? What penalties? Which do you lean on more? And of course, what are the alternatives? I mean, basically, in cities where you've got a lot of old housing stock, there aren't that many alternatives. Heat pumps don't necessarily make sense here often, but then you're left with what is the other solution? And then, it could be district heating, but in the near term, it's difficult to get around gas, and this is the problem. And I suppose the government has come up with a bit of a compromise. Rather than forcing swift changes already from next year, they've kind of kicked the can down the road a bit and given people essentially a breathing space of 4 years, so that anyone can go and install new gas or even oil heating systems for at least the next 4 years. And I don't know why you'd necessarily want to if you know that beyond that point you're also going to get penalised, especially with a carbon market that is increasingly taking on the role of pricing, the fuels that heat us as well. But yeah, so they've kicked the can down the road a little bit, you can say, in their compromise, but you can see where the trajectory is going.
And also, I mean, quite significant this half of the year, or the first half of the year, I should say, was the end of the nukes. I mean, Germany basically stopped producing electricity from nuclear power plants.
Yeah, that's to be expected, given that it was such a long-standing and hard policy decision in the first place. I mean, it wobbled because of this energy crisis, and I suppose you have to remember that even the CDU and although the FDP was probably not very happy with, so that the FDP and the Liberals, they're also a part of this government, the CDU, the Christian Democrats, Conservatives under Chancellor Merkel, they had agreed on this. Although they might not have been happy with it, they had agreed with it a decade ago. And I think the energy crisis opened an opportunity to revisit that, but I think it was unrealistic to expect that all of a sudden Germany would then say, "Oh no, we're going to abandon our nuclear exit." It's quite a deep-seated objective, and reinvest in nuclear, because ultimately it does mean reinvesting in it. It means upgrading these nuclear plants as well as refueling them. It's a long-term policy to do that because everything was based around exiting nuclear by the end of last year.
Of course. And from the outside looking in, it looks as though, what's Germany doing? It's got this sort of very relatively carbon-free form of electricity generation, and it's turning it off.
Of course, and this comes back to what's, I suppose, how Germany sees these things differently, and that's a widespread cultural view. I mean, it's not just something that's restricted to the Greens. There are plenty of conservatives who are also wary of nuclear energy, and have been for a long time. It goes back to, you can take it back as far as you like. You can go back to the Cold War, the associations of nuclear energy with nuclear weapons, the disaster in Chernobyl, the experience of people in Bavaria being told that they have to keep their children indoors and they can't play in sandpits or gather mushrooms because these things are now infected. And also, where is Germany going to put the nuclear waste? That's been an ongoing saga for decades, associated with corruption and bribery, and it's a big mess that ultimately a lot of people became turned off by, and I guess you eventually got a majority of the population who just agreed with the position of leaving this technology because of its long-term problems. And
absolutely,
yeah, and I think that you'll never get that majority support back, and so and ultimately it doesn't really sit comfortably with the technology of choice, which is a system built around solar and wind. And because there is a strong consensus in favor of that, I think you're always going to find that there's not really any deep support for nuclear energy in Germany. They don't fit together so comfortably, those technologies, and they will erode each other's profitability, put it that way, one or the other, and so they will require support and intervention from the state, both of them.
There are other member states in the EU who are using
it very differently, of course.
Using it very differently. But Nathan, just a final sort of roundup question. What are the issues that that'll be the main points or the main issues going forward in the next 6 months?
I think the government's going to try to resolve this heating law dispute. I think that has bearing on Germany for gas demand in the coming years. How quickly is Germany going to be able to reduce its gas demand? And reducing demand is not just something vital for climate policy. It's also a key lever for being able to reduce its dependence on its exposure to international prices. I mean, a lot of the crisis that Europe is in is because it is dependent on the outside world for energy. And that's not really going to change. But the degree to which it's dependent on the outside world for energy, it's always going to, it can't support itself with its own sources of renewable energy sufficiently. It's going to need to produce masses of hydrogen, and it's always going to be easier and cheaper to get this from abroad. So reducing its exposure to natural gas, that's one thing, that the heating law, what it's able to get in place, ensuring that it gets those LNG terminals built. One of them probably won't be completed for this winter, but maybe that's not so bad. And then ensuring that the build out of renewables does in fact pick up pace, especially compared to last decade. So the government has already taken steps to clear the hurdles that were obstructing faster build out of solar and wind. It's going to be, I think, under pressure to make sure that works. And of course, power market design. How do you, I suppose, improve the incentives so that we get the gas plants that we need to bridge the period that we're going to need them, and to provide that backup capacity, while ensuring that the people who would operate such a thing, are interested in building and maintaining these things, because they're obviously not going to get enough running hours in a system that is increasingly dominated by solar and wind.
I mean, that's maybe for some that would be watering down a lot of the market mechanisms, but maybe we'll leave that for another discussion, Nate. Thanks very much for being a guest on the Montel Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
And listeners, we're going to be taking a break over the summer, but we'll see you again in early August. Thank you. Goodbye.